Today we're looking at Chapter 4, Culture as a Guide to Theoretical Exploration of the Baltic States. Although you'll notice very quickly while reading the book that it really focuses on Lithuania instead of Latvia and Estonia. And the author talks about the reason for that, and they give the reason most similar case studies. This is the idea that a group of countries like these three are so similar that you can focus on one of them and make the same generalizations about the other two. So that's what we have here, a most similar case study of the Baltic states and media, but focusing on Lithuania with implications for Estonia and Latvia. Now, let's quickly think about pre-19 history. Very similar to Poland, which we just talked about. A history of occupation and oppression before 1918. World War I ends, 1918 comes about, Lithuania becomes an independent state. Lithuania starts developing just like Poland does. However, World War II happens, and after World War II, Lithuania is absorbed into the Soviet bloc. So you start to see very quickly a communist media style, just like we talked about in Poland, however, more strict than in Poland. Because remember, in Poland, it was probably the most liberal and free of Soviet satellite countries. So here, part of the conversation the author brings in very quickly is culture and occupation and oppression. The idea that in Lithuania and these Baltic states that every time they were occupied or oppressed, this directly affects their media because they're not allowed any media. There is no media freedom for the oppressed in the world. So what do? How do you preserve your culture, your language, your news, what's important to you as a people, if you're occupied and oppressed? Well, you have to get inventive. And it starts up this saying in Lithuania called making Lithuania Lithuania. Well, how do you do that? It makes you think. Is news the only medium? Short answer is no. Of course not. How did Lithuanians keep their culture and news alive? The arts. Poetry, playwrights, traveling bards, music, paintings, all of these things, art, are media. And that's exactly how Lithuanians were able to circulate news about what was going on in their country, even under hardcore oppression. Traveling bards and playwrights would go from town to town with messages in the form of art. And it makes you wonder, is art still political today? Do we see political messages in our music? That's something we will definitely be talking about moving forward, but something that's incredibly important here that we haven't yet talked about. In this chapter, we're not going to focus so much on the different models and different time periods as much as we're going to focus on the different variables more specifically. Right, because Lithuania is so similar to Poland in much of its history, we already know a lot of the background as far as what was going on during the Soviet era. Also, we know newspaper circulation mirrors exactly what happened in Poland. Early on, extremely low literacy rates. Throughout time, a lot of censorship. Newspapers were considered propaganda. By the time Lithuania became an independent state, they had already switched over to the media of radio and television. Therefore, newspapers never really gained ground as far as being a dominant form of news consumption in the country. So we're going to forego talking about newspapers, and we're going to look more specifically here at political parallelism. So at the end of 1989 and going into the early 90s, Soviet Union falls, Lithuania becomes independent. And at this point in time, they adopt a multi-party system, not a two-party system, but true multi-party system like most of Western Europe has. And at first, political parallelism was high. Parties did influence media. However, this ends really quickly. And in Lithuania, we start shifting by the late 1990s to a more two-party dominant system. Part of this is because true multi-partyism never really had strong roots in Lithuania to begin with. For all of Soviet era, it was a one-party system. Before that, it was occupation and oppression, generally by monarchs or militaristic states. So the idea of having a Green Party, a Liberal Democratic Party, a Christian Democratic Party. There were no strong roots for these political affiliations within Lithuania. And what's more is that a lot of these people that ended up becoming politicians, charisma of the individual mattered a whole lot more than party affiliation. And in fact, when it suited politicians, they would switch parties without even considering the implications for it. And people didn't mind because they paid attention to their message more than their political affiliation or their party affiliation. So we end up with this very unique situation where political parallelism in Lithuania dies off very quickly after they become independent. However, though, is political parallelism gone completely today? Now, to answer that question, we're going to have to wait a second because part of the answer is involved in journalistic professionalism and the conversation that we're going to have there. Now let's talk about the role of the state in Lithuania. This is a very interesting and unique case. All right, so first off, something I want to say, and I like to always say at the beginning of this course, is that regardless of your take over the general question of what affects more, media on politics or politics on media, one of the most interesting things about in democracies, in order for media to be able to affect politics, politics has to grant media independence. Think about that. Freedom of the press has to exist in the Constitution. Who creates the Constitution? Politics. So regardless of which way you think about the argument, media freedom does start with politics. All right, so we talk about two roles of the state here in this chapter. The first role is that the state makes sure media stay independent, once again because of the long history of occupation and oppression. The second role of the state, though, inside of media, is to safeguard culture. And there are three specific ways that the government of Lithuania does this. And I love this. This is so innovative for a government to do. The first one, that all media, all foreign media rather, if it's broadcast television inside of Lithuania, it has to include Lithuanian subtitles. You cannot broadcast foreign media inside of Lithuania without Lithuanian subtitles. Second one, and this one is really great, right? I've never heard of this in any other country. Media organizations can be fined for making grammar mistakes in Lithuanian. Granted, I have never heard of that law being implemented, but the fact that it's on the books says a good bit about how important keeping their language unified is to the people. And the third one is that any foreign names in media have to be translated into Lithuanian. All right, now this one, I've talked to people before that come down on both sides. One argument is that this does help the people of Lithuania understand and integrate people coming in from all over the world into their country, and it safeguards the Lithuanian culture. The opposite end of that argument is that for people who want to move to Lithuania, they kind of feel as if their own culture and identity is being taken away from them by having to switch their name into Lithuanian. Now again, I've never really heard of any big stories about any issue with these three laws taking place. But still, regardless, these are three really interesting laws. I'm really interested, what do you think as far as, are these a big deal? Do these constitute as the incursion of government into media? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Let me know. Now, journalistic professionalism. And again, at the end of this, we're going to tie this into political parallelism as well. But so professionalism in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, generally all throughout time, you could argue has probably been rather weak. Pre-1918 and even during Soviet era, you could say journalism was weak because your first journalists in the countries were actually artists, writers of literature, the traveling bards. These were your first journalists. They had no official training like we would think of journalists today from higher schools of journalism. All right, though, as we move forward in the course, we'll talk about do you actually need that training to be a good journalist or not. But that's a different question for a different day. During Soviet-era journalism, it was a one-party system, communist state. By the standards of our models, that's not democratic, therefore can't be professional. However, once again, is a democratic standard of journalistic professionalism the only standard or the correct standard of what it means to be professional in journalism? It's something we have to address sooner or later. And today, all right, moving into now, the end of the book to now, what does our author say about journalistic professionalism? In general, still weak, still low, for three very specific reasons given to us in the chapter. The first one is due to the marketization of journalism in particular. Now, what is a marketization? We've talked a little bit before, but now let's get into it. Marketization means corporations take over media instead of government. So corporations buy media organizations or create organizations. A business. What are the main goals of any businesses? Usually to provide a service and then to make a profit off of that service, or a good rather than a service. But for a private business, part of what your purpose is to make profit. The author argues, and this is something that we're going to come back to constantly throughout the semester, if one of your goals as a business is to make a profit, and yet you are a news organization, how do you turn a profit off of that? And at the same time, be independent, unbiased, a check against government, the fourth estate, watchdog journalist. Can you do both of those at the same time, effectively? Now, the author argues in this case in Lithuania, no, it's not always a good thing, and that this does hinder journalistic professionalism. Right? Another portion, our second reason why journalistic professionalism is low in the country, is because there is not a strong public service broadcasting. Right? Now, in the U.S., other than PBS and NPR, we're not really used to hearing about public broadcasting services. It's not that big of a thing. In a lot of democracies, though, it is a big thing. However, author says in Lithuania it is not. Right? And that hurts journalistic professionalism. And in the third point, something we haven't talked about, questionable practices. Here we're talking about illegal things. Things like blackmail, things like extortion, things like taking away editorial decisions because of economic ties. Perhaps you have a board inside your journalist room, and you have different stories on the board. And in some days, you see a post-it note with a name on it. And that's it. That's all it says. It's just a name. But you know in your newsroom that means nothing negative about this person. Or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps you see a name and it means to you, all right, I can go after this politician. What happens, and what the authors talks about that we've seen sometimes, is that some media corporations will go after politicians that are not spending revenue making campaign ads in their newspapers or on their TVs or radio stations. And they'll go after them with negative ads. Now, once that politician starts posting or putting money into advertising for that company, suddenly all the news is positive. Extortion, blackmail, I don't know, that's pretty borderline. That's some questionable practices right there. Right? And that practice in and of itself, once again, leaks over to political parallelism. Because the moment you start being politically biased, regardless of your reasoning behind it, that increases your political parallelism. That is, newspapers are following the narrative of a specific political party. Now, in this case we're talking about, it's because these politicians are investing money through advertising. But it's still influence. It's the same outcome. So for all of these reasons, the author argues, journalistic professionalism in Lithuania is low. All right, now let's think about wrapping everything together for Lithuania and the Baltic states. Overall, newspaper circulation is low. Overall, journalist professionalism is low, both characteristic of the polarized pluralist model. Political parallelism seems to be a mixed bag, not for the reasons that the models were originally talking about. And role of the state tends to be low. However, you could make an argument that the 3 laws in Lithuania are actually a big deal, and therefore they are representative of state intervention. So you end up with a mixed bag / leaning towards the polarized pluralist model. And the author argues this is ridiculous. Of course, the author doesn't say that, but this is just ridiculous. These variables are not representative of what's important in the media system in Lithuania, the author argues. They're not descriptive of it, and they're not telling us why things are the way that they are. The author says, you have to look at culture in order to do this. Now, this is a big deal for political science because political scientists tend to walk away from culture as an explanation for anything. Okay? Because culture can be so many different things, when you start using culture as an explanation, it's hard to get into the nitty-gritty of really what you are talking about. But here, the author is making the argument that you need a cultural explanation. And what do you think? At me in the forums. Do you think culture influences media of a country? I'd be interested to know what you think. But what's more, even with the models leaning towards the polarized pluralist, how's Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia doing today? In short, fantastic. Okay, Lithuania and Freedom House has a 91 out of 100 for the past 2 years straight. It's one of the freest, most democratic countries in the world. Reporters Without Border for Lithuania, they rank 28 out of 180 countries and territories around the globe. One of the top countries. And they're up 2 spots from last year where they were number 30. So in short, regardless of these models, Lithuania is ranked as one of the freest countries and one of the freest media systems in the world. I think the author would argue, and rightfully so, that these models are not representative of Lithuania holding that spot via Freedom House or Reporters Without Border. That's something we'll have to reconcile. But does that mean everything is perfect and peachy in Lithuania? No, of course not. And whenever you do look on Reporters Without Border, like all of you were starting to do in the forums, you start to see a story developing in Lithuania that the government is actually pushing back against media freedom. Reporters Without Border talks about last year the Defense Ministry tried to put forth a law that said anything going on in government that wasn't completely finished could not be covered by media, meaning no freedom of access to information unless something was already completely done. So that means no investigative journalism into the actual current workings of politics in the country. Now, granted, that law was scrapped because protest. Good for Lithuania. However, once again, Reporters Without Borders is still arguing that journalists in the country still have a problem obtaining information from government. Now, for some of you, you're also going to pick countries that rank really high, just like Lithuania. You know, in the 90s or close to 100 in Freedom House, or in the top 10 to 20 spots in Reporters Without Borders. And you're going to see some of the stories for your papers when you're looking at what are some issues that you could focus on. Some of these are nitpicky, because things in Lithuania are doing really, really good, but there are still problems. And journalists being able to obtain information, to act as a fourth estate, to act as watchdog journalists. This is an issue for Lithuania. And it goes to show something I always like to say. Democratization is always and everywhere an unfinished process. Just because Lithuania is doing great, it doesn't mean they're perfect, and it doesn't mean that they're not going to do better in the future. It's something we should always remember whenever we move through our cases.